If you're watching this video, chances are pretty good that you've seen the Dirty Dan SpongeBob meme, which is usually accompanied by a text box describing some of the most puerile actions committed by man. But beyond its impact as a disturbing haute cuisine meme, Dirty Dan is part of an obscure and largely unexplored corner of the SpongeBob chronology. Sandy's past. If you haven't seen the original episode, this one may be a bit confusing, but the panel for the Dirty Dan meme comes from a scene in which Bob and Patrick play that they're criminals Sandy talks about in her sleep. They called Pinhead Larry and Dirty Dan obviously. Knowing that they are not only mentioned in this episode, and thanks to several curious circumstances involving these characters, which we'll talk about in a moment, there has been quite a bit of theorizing about the true identity of Dirty Dan, and even, lately, a theory was popularized that he was a warning about the disturbed creator of iCarly, Drake and Josh, and Zoe 101, Dan Schneider. So today we'll clear up this mysterious mystery once and for all, inside and outside of the SpongeBob series. Our first stop in this investigation, as in many others, is in the episode that gives rise to today's mystery. Titled Survival of the Idiots, we're talking about the legendary episode from the second season, which opens with Bob and Patrick running to Sandy's dome to play with her. However, the dome is completely covered in metal and has a giant sign on the door that says "Keep Out." And they find a tape of Sandy explaining that she is hibernating for the winter and asks that no one wake her up, because she gets very upset if they wake her up during hibernation. Patrick completely ignores the tape and opens the dome door, discovering that it is completely covered in snow. After playing around a bit and taking off his helmets, taking advantage of the wet snow, they hear noises in Sandy's treehouse and discover that Squirrel is now gigantic from eating so many acorns for her hibernation and is sleeping very soundly. In between dreams, Sandy says, "I've had enough of your dastardly deeds, Dirty Dan. I'll capture you and your partner Pinhead Larry, or I'll stop calling myself Sheriff Sandy." Bob laughs, saying she must be dreaming of Texas outlaws, and annoys her by saying he's Dirty Dan. Sandy says she will put him in jail at the expense of the taxpayers. That is, the people who do pay their taxes. So the implication is that the main crime of Pinhead Larry and Dirty Dan is simply tax evasion, which I don't consider very high on the scale of malevolent acts, but apparently Sandy does, because later he says they are full of pure evil, like the cartoons in the newspaper. Eventually, Bob and Patrick wake up Arenita and she almost finishes them off thinking they are Dirty Dan and Pinhead Larry. Except that she falls asleep again. Patrick makes her some earmuffs with lint from her belly button so she won't hear them. And they leave the house to play in the snow. They play at being the outlaws in Sandy's dream and eventually end up fighting to see who is Dirty Dan. The fight causes Sandy's earmuffs to fall off and she angrily attacks them to give those evil outlaws their comeuppance. Sandy digs them graves and everything and buries them with tombstones that say Dirty Dan and Pinhead Larry, but Bob and Patrick make it out alive, although they discover that the dome door is frozen and they are trapped there. The rest of the episode we see them trying to escape and survive the cold, so they steal all of Sandy's hair, and at the end we see her now bald and awake using Bob and Patrick as a coat while her fur grows back. Having seen all this, the clear implication is that Pinhead Larry and Dirty Dan were outlaws from Sandy's past when she was still living in Texas. But if we watch the series carefully, we notice several problems with this. First and most importantly, Sandy is not a sheriff and as far as we know has always been a scientist and that's it. But her past is mostly a mystery, so who knows. And although it is strange that she mentions so many specific details about them, and it seems that they are figures from her past, several members of the community started to see this whole issue from another perspective, completely moving away from the mystery within the series and seeing it from the real world. According to them, it wasn't about an outlaw or anything like that, but rather it was a hidden warning to a real and quite dirty person. Dan Schneider. I warn you, this part of the video will get a little disturbing, because we'll be talking about things and abuses that happened at Nickelodeon several years ago. You see, Dan Schneider was one of the most important faces of Nickelodeon, as he not only created several of the channel's top series, but produced them, wrote multiple episodes, and even directed and acted in several of them. The controversy started in the year 2013, with several accusations on Twitter from Amanda Bynes, starring actress of The Amanda Show, the first really successful show created by Dan Schneider in 1999. She accused him of inappropriate touching and insinuated abuse, which started a series of bizarre rumors about him, with the rise of the Me Too movement and a rather disturbing vibe in which Jeanette McCarthy, who you'll remember as Sam from iCarly, "Here you go, Schneider, look what you made me do." The rumors began to pick up more steam. his bizarre foot fetish began to be pointed out, as he had an unhealthy fixation on making actresses do things with their feet on screen. He would also use the show's social media to ask minors to post or send pictures of their feet, which with all this context doesn't look good at all. He was even accused of getting Jamie Lynn Spears, the star of Zoey 101, pregnant, which would directly cause the cancellation of the series, according to rumors. Obviously, this was all very disturbing because we are talking about minors, and in 2018, videos appear in which Schneider behaves in a very disturbing way with actresses, along with a lot of other allegations and rumors of abuse in the shows he was directing. In March of that year, Nickelodeon severed relations with Dan Schneider after investigating the matter internally, and in recent years many more allegations and complaints have surfaced against the producer. Deadline reported complaints of abusive behavior on the production team, inappropriate requests for messages from crew members, and an explosive temper with tantrums and yelling. He would even send angry emails and texts to child actors on his shows at times when they were not working. He has been denounced by many more people at the time, including public complaints from Alexa Nicholas of Zoey 101 and Jeanette McCarthy, who tell of abuse and very dirty deeds Dan did when they were between the ages of 12 and 15. And back to today's mystery, there's a problem with that theory. If you look at the timeline, you'll notice that the episode was produced long before the events of the controversy. Survival of the Idiots was produced in the year 2000, when Schneider had barely been working on Amanda's show for a year or two in his first role as creator. Almost everything that happened dates from 2005 to here, and while there are a few complaints from this period, especially from some of the writers on Amanda's show, I don't think it was enough for Schneider to earn the reputation he got 18 years later. And aside from that, I highly doubt that they would cross over the animation divisions with the live-action show divisions within Nick, so it seems highly unlikely. And while I can't rule it out entirely, Dirty Dan was simply a classic cowboy man in the Old West stories. It's not too crazy to think it's all a coincidence. Here, my research hit a giant wall, so I decided to backtrack a bit and pick up the angle within the show. Dirty Dan has some very minor appearances in graffiti and such in other episodes. We even see again the tombstones that Sandy made in the episode shopping list. But there seems to be no real confirmation of who this criminal is. I was about to accept that the mystery was unanswerable, until I stumbled upon a very odd episode of Camp Coral. Camp Coral is a very inconsistent prequel to SpongeBob SquarePants, which I paid no attention to because the show clearly wasn't aimed at me and threw straight into the trash in the story of the original series. Or well, so I thought until I saw the Kitchen Sponge episode, where it's revealed that the past was changed by Sandy, who sent her younger version to this camp to stop Plankton from stealing the Krabby Patty formula and keep the timeline stable. Yes, both versions of Sandy talk about her plan at the end of the episode through an interdimensional communicator and everything. The implication is that with this she creates the timeline of Camp Coral and prevents everything from changing for the worse. And to understand what this has to do with Dirty Dan, we need to talk about the Cosmic Shake. The Cosmic Shake is a video game that came out at the beginning of this year. And it is very interesting because it shows us Bob and Patrick traveling to several parallel universes, meeting several versions of the show's characters. Right in the first world they arrive in a bikini bottom cowboy version where, you guessed it, Sandy is the sheriff. And her name is just Sheriff Sandy. Exactly what Sandy says she's called in her sleep in the episode of Dirty Dan. And that's all we need to know to understand this mystery. As we saw in Camp Coral, Sandy is the only bikini bottom dweller with the ability to contact alternate versions of herself, even across time. We also know that our Sandy is not a sheriff but a scientist, but there is a Sheriff Sandy in the Wild West timeline. It's pretty obvious that Dirty Dan and Pinhead Larry must be part of this universe, constantly evading taxes and running from the law. So the simplest explanation is that Sandy knows about Dirty Dan because of things the Sheriff Sandy has told her, or we're dealing more with Doctor Strange type rules in the multiverse of insanity. And Sandy's dream is literally an adventure that Sheriff Sandy was having at the time, which would explain her ability to detect that Plankton wanted to steal the formula in the past through interdimensional dreams. And honestly, after everything we've seen today, I wouldn't be surprised at all. So I hope you liked this strange interdimensional video. Like it if you did, comment on what other mysteries you'd like to see solved, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.